everybody. I'm happy to say that we are here at the Family Online Safety Institute conference. I'm Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee. I am a senior fellow in governance studies and the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. We are a nonprofit global think tank located here in Washington, D.C. And I'm excited to do this panel for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, I want to say thank you to Steve and to Erin. I've known Steve for so many years that I choose not to count because then people know my age. But most importantly, I know that he is equally committed to this issue. And today's breakout session is really going to delve into, I think, an issue that has touched most of us, the digital divide. I know personally that this has been an issue that I've dealt with professionally and as a parent. First and foremost, I'm writing a book on this, so it'll be out next year on the U.S. digital divide. But secondly, I was one of those parents whose children became what I call the COVID kids in terms of their learning. A college student that had to essentially look online and figure out what was best suited for his academic needs, and a 14-year-older who had to use the computer to actually exit out of her last year of middle school. And I would tell you this, as a parent who has means, where we actually have the ability to connect throughout our home, there were millions of children who did not. In fact, 15 to 16 million students who did not have access to either home broadband or device, and 9 million of them that did not have either one. And out of that, students that were Black, Hispanic, and from indigenous communities were primarily affected. And we're going to see some of those consequences going forward. So this conversation is really important. And I'm happy to be joined by folks that I consider to be my friend, but also people who are working in the community from their particular lens, trying to make this better. And so let me go ahead and introduce who's here with us in our breakout session, with the hope that we will start this conversation and then go into some audience Q&A. So don't hold back. Please come on with your questions because we're going to try to ask as many as possible. So I've got with us today Broderick Johnson, who is at Comcast Corporation. I'm going to ask all of our speakers to actually say more about your particular role and what you do when you actually answer your first question. Antonio Tijerino, who's at the Hispanic Heritage Foundation. John Windhausen, Jr., who I've actually known more than I can actually count, who's with the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition. And Keyla Hernandez-Ulloa, who is actually going to join us from the Federal Communications Commission when we actually solve her technical issues. I'm calling out to those from the FCC. We have a technical issue here that hopefully will be solved. So let me jump right to you, John, in terms of the digital divide. You and I have been doing this for a really long time, and I know you have been out there pushing for this local digital infrastructure, which I think is very important. I want to kind of ask you, and again, say more about the organization, your role there. How bad is the digital divide? And in particular, kind of moving this word bad, right? What is it about those who sit on the wrong side of digital opportunity? How do we actually address this? And what are you seeing out there in your work that's actually approaching this subject?
Well, thanks, Nicole, very much. It's a great pleasure to see you, to participate in this exciting conversation. I wish we had better news. You know, we should have solved this digital divide by now. We had a national broadband plan in 2010 that made all these great predictions of things we were going to do by the year 2020. And here we are still, you know, after that decade, where we made quite a bit of progress, but the problem is still really significant. And just a minute about our organization. So it's we shorten it because Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband is such a mouthful. So we call ourselves the Shelby Coalition. And we're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., but we now have over 300 members from around the country. And our mission is to support broadband, high quality broadband and affordable broadband for anchor institutions and their communities. And it's the addition of the communities angle that makes us kind of unique, because what we try to do is be an advocate for the anchor institutions, but also it's not just about the institution, it's about the people. And we are everybody should have a high quality, low cost broadband connection. And a lot of times the anchor institutions can be part of that solution, but we haven't taken full advantage of what the anchor institutions can do to help solve the digital divide. Now that may change with today's signing of the Infrastructure Act. So we're very hopeful we can get to that in a few moments. But I would say the problem, according to Pew, which has the most reliable numbers, I think, of anybody. They estimate about 75% of homes have broadband today, which means about 25% don't. That's about 80 million people in the United States that don't have broadband. And that's a shame. And that, unfortunately, that number of 75% of homes that do have broadband has been kind of stable for the last 5 years or so. So even though there's a tremendous amount of effort being putting in to solving this digital divide, we haven't made as much progress as we would have liked to. And of course, those numbers are even worse for Black families. I think it's down to 71%. Hispanic families down to 65% that have broadband access. So it's worse for people of color. It's worse for people with disabilities. And the primary problem is that the darn expense of broadband is too high. Most of the surveys show that it's the cost of the broadband connection that is the biggest barrier to getting people connected. So that's why we're here still talking about this, Nicole, after 25 years that we've known each other.
Oh my goodness. I know, John, don't you tell my age, okay?
I won't go any further than that, but I will say we've got a great opportunity. We've got to do more and change the current paradigm so we solve this in the next 5 years. I'm determined that we can do it.
Well, and I appreciate, you laying that out, because I do think the same thing. This book that I'm actually putting out is entitled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, right? Because the things that are actually at stake are not necessarily whether or not you're connected or to a device or you have broadband, but whether you can participate in this new digital economy, something that the pandemic showed us is really important.
It sure did. Right. And
That's
even if the numbers are staying stable, the problem is getting worse, because you need an internet connection more than ever today because of everything that's shifting to an online experience. So it's a very significant problem.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Broderick, I want to turn to you. I mean, first and foremost, welcome to this new role. I mean, you are not an unfamiliar face to many of us who watched you during the growth of My Brother's Keeper under the Obama administration.
Yes.
But more importantly, you're dealing with this homework gap that soon-to-be chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel will actually speak about, which is this divide that exists educationally in terms of kids' access to broadband. Talk to us, one, about what you're doing at Comcast, and then two, let's talk a little bit about this homework gap and why you think it's important for companies like Comcast to play a role.
Nicole, thank you very much. And it's great to be on a panel that with your energy to moderate and move this discussion along. And it's great to see you again. And John Windhausen. So I don't know, Nicole, which of us has known John longer? I go back to, I'm trying to remember when I first met John, but I know it was decades ago. And it takes me back to, the fact that I was in the Clinton White House in 1998 when we had a number of events around the digital divide and the discussion about that. And, back then, of course, the core central issue had to do with connectivity. And while connectivity is certainly a tremendous challenge, as John mentioned, for reaching so many millions of Americans, the digital divide has certainly changed. It's evolved into a even more complicated set of conversations and challenges around what the nature of that divide is. And so I would just say, first, with respect to me joining Comcast, I joined Comcast back in mid-July. Very excited to be able to join Comcast in two leadership roles. First, as the executive vice president for public policy. And there are lots of executive vice presidents for public policy, people who get to lead great public policy efforts for corporations and nonprofits. But I'm very proud of that. But I'm especially also proud of the fact that I was asked to serve as executive vice president for digital equity. It says an awful lot about the degree to which the leadership of Comcast sees it as one of the issues of the highest priority of this company to close the digital divide and to bring about digital equity. So with respect to the FCC Chair, Jessica Rosenworcel, who, as we know and are quite proud that she's now been nominated by President Biden to be the first woman permanent chair of the FCC, she certainly coined this phrase, the homework gap, to describe how the broader connectivity gap, or again, digital divide, specifically impacts students. We've all read the stories about kids doing their homework in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant because there was no other way for them to get on a Wi-Fi network. This is an incredibly serious and issue that has been a real challenge now for several decades, as has the broader digital divide set of issues. And there are several reasons for it. And John mentioned affordability, and no question, for many families and individuals, affordability is a big issue, but a central issue. But for a lot of other families and individuals who have access to low-cost broadband, and certainly in our Internet Essentials program, that's been a big part of it. And as you look at what's going to be available with the passage of this new infrastructure bill, affordability isn't so much going to be the challenge for many as just awareness about what exists and about the impact of what exists when an individual or family is able to take advantage of the broadband access that is available to them at low or no cost. Common Sense Media and Boston Consulting Group study showed that 15 to 16 million students didn't have connectivity when the COVID-19 pandemic began. And within one semester, though, that had dropped to 12 million. That's a 25% increase. That's great. Any kind of a 25% decrease, I should say, in something like that is very important. But there's still 12 million students who very much are being left behind. So there's a lot of work that we have to do. No question, students without a home internet connection or device were completely shut out of the virtual classroom. And I think about, as you were mentioning, Nicole, I've got 2 college-age students. Well, one daughter who graduated from college, unfortunately didn't have the opportunity to have a ceremony to celebrate, but still very proud that she graduated from college and will be on her way to law school. But a son who spent 18 months at home studying to get through his freshman and sophomore year of college, pretty much. Having that connection at home was incredibly important to him. We clearly owe it to all our students to mitigate learning loss, though, and ensure a strong educational foundation. So very proud. Again, I joined Comcast knowing this has been a company that's been a leader in working to close the digital divide for over a decade, especially through our Internet Essentials program. And we've continued to enhance that program to reach even more families. So as we get into the discussion, I really look forward to talking about our other initiatives as well.
Well, I appreciate that, Broderick, because I think you bring what many of us who have been working in this space for quite some time. I don't know, I might still have a few months over you on John, because I knew John when I was starting tech centers in Chicago, if you remember, John. I was 18. Okay, just remember that. Like the hell I am now, but I was 18.
Right, no, I was at least in my mid-20s, if not older, so okay, all right.
But I want to just go to Keyla, right? Because as we think about this issue, obviously data matters, and what the commission has done as part of its own pandemic response and what the commission continues to do has been important to level some of these playing fields. Keyla, first and foremost, tell us specifically what you do with the commission. But most importantly, what is the FCC doing currently to sort of track what we're talking about today? And, what efforts have been put on the table just from a helicopter view? And then we'll go into more detail later.
Thank you, everyone. Apologies, have been going through tech issues, but here I am. I'm Keyla Hernandez-Ulloa with the Federal Communications Commission. I'm Associate Division Chief for Consumer Affairs and Outreach Division. And long story short, that really means we are the division that really interacts with the public to make all the regulatory issues of the commission more relatable to the consumer. Everyone here is really knowledgeable at the FCC, but we travel a lot and we find out that people know about us, but don't know all of the things we do. In terms of the conversation today, there are 2 things I'd like to highlight that the FCC is doing. We're doing a lot. We're doing things in telehealth. We're doing things to try to get rural communities connected to broadband. But as it relates to the consumer, the everyday person who really needs this connection, we have the Emergency Connectivity Fund and we have the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. And very quickly, I'll say the Emergency Connectivity Fund is really not a consumer direct applicable program. It's more for schools, library, and consortia to gain funding so that they can help the consumer, especially students, anybody looking for a job or healthcare access. It's a $7.1 billion fund that helps for these services. The Emergency Broadband Benefit Program is a more direct-to-consumer application. Consumers who are eligible for the benefit of $50 a month can apply. This program, and both programs actually, came about because the FCC wanted to address issues that were happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I will stop there.
Well, we'll talk more, Keyla, too, about the program's impact. I mean, first and foremost, let's just congratulate the FCC. 6 million people signed up for the emergency broadband benefit within 2 months of its launch. That says a lot around the sort of needs that people had, as well as the aspirations that people had to be connected. And Tony, I want to bring you into this conversation as well, right? Because part of what we're talking about today, we kind of started with John, right? This is not a good news story. Broderick sort of added the fact that we're laying on top of this, these homework gaps that were pre-existing. And Kayla's telling us that we've done a lot, right? But there's something else that's been happening, which are these learning losses. And that's something that you and I share the sensitivity to, particularly for students of color, which John actually indicated, although we made progress in Broderick as well, we still have a lot to do. A lot of Latina kids, a lot of Black American kids, a lot of kids of indigenous communities, et cetera, poverty. They did not do well with this. The moral compass, we failed them when it came to getting them connected. Speak to us about this particular impact on the Hispanic kids the Latina kids that you actually deal with, and more importantly, how this ties into other issues that are somewhat invisible in this digital divide debate when it comes to students.
Well, let me start by saying you and I have shared personally what we've gone through as parents and dealing with our kids, like you said earlier, that have means. And have parents that are very involved. You could imagine what other kids are dealing with. But I want to thank you, Nicole, and you need to get that book out because it's going to be a tremendous resource for all of us that are doing this work. And I'm also thrilled to see our friend Jessica Rosenworcel's on track to be the FCC chair. She's a real asset for our communities, and I've seen it firsthand as we've visited urban, suburban, and rural areas where Latinos are with me, and she's interacting with our communities, and as she said, to inform her work at the FCC. And also I'm comforted that Kayla is holding it down at the FCC with her, and thanks Stephen Balcom for including me and feeding off the glow of Nicole as she gives off with her intellect, energy, and advocacy. But let me start with answering your question that there is no vaccine to the digital divide crisis, which was caused an educational crisis and exacerbated a health crisis. It's going to impact our youth and our community for years to come, including their momentum to enter the workforce, which we're all worried about. America is worried about. So just some facts. Latinos are more likely than whites to say their lack of high-speed internet at home leads to certain disadvantages. And I think one of our panel members was talking about the Pew Institute. And so their research on broadband abolition showed that only 65% of Latino households have broadband subscription compared with white communities at over 80%. And beyond the broadband gaps, let's also not forget that 80% of white adults reported owning a computer compared to 67% of Latinos, the lowest of any group. So when it comes to access the internet, mobile devices play a larger role for Latinos compared with whites. 1 out of 4 Latinos, 25%, are smartphone-only internet users, meaning that they own a smartphone but lack the traditional broadband services, so which is more than twice the rate of whites in the same category. And not surprisingly, those figures also directly correlate with households' annual incomes, with those earning $50K a year or less being the least likely to afford broadband. So the Latino community consistently cites prices as the number one barrier to broadband adoption. And it's compounded with the lack of culturally responsive programs and prepare Latino students and their parents with these digital skills. And that means we're falling behind. And our parents are falling behind with the kids. So it got worse after COVID. And I call it the tech equity gap. I know others call it the digital divide or the homework gap. But it's impacting our youth's ability to learn and prepare for the future. So I just have to cite this. When we talk about our kids kind of zoning out during this time, according to the Bellwether Educational Partners, over 3 million students in the United States during COVID stopped attending Zoom school. since the pandemic, and they still can't find them. And the prediction is that between 10 and 25% of those students are from the most marginalized populations. And they've completely missed out on over a year of learning, a year and a half actually at this point. And one of the biggest reasons was lack of high-speed internet. So we actually did a national study that I know Jessica Rosa-Warso has cited in the past that found that Latino students were most likely to say their grades suffered because of lack of access to broadband. And the students were also most likely to say they couldn't finish their homework because of lack of access, and were most likely to use a smartphone, as we said earlier, to actually do their college applications. Now, I can't even write a text message to you, Nicole, without insulting you with some autocorrect. Now, these guys were actually filling out their college applications. Now, this is also worrisome that one of the findings we found was that teachers said Latinx parents were most difficult to communicate with because of the parents' lack of access to the internet for email communication. So it wasn't even a language barrier. It was a tech barrier. And RAND actually did a survey of teachers and found that 75% found that students' lack of access to tech tools and internet as a serious obstacle to even being able to implement their lessons. And so this is an issue that has become an equity issue. And you have to deal with it when you're talking about the Latino population. When you talk about the future, we're expanding about 6 times faster than non-Latinos in this country. And we're the youngest segment of the population, which is who we need to serve the most, because 1 out of 3 Latinos are actually school age right now of our entire population. I don't know if you know this, but the most common age for whites in the United States, the one that's most populated, is 58. For Latinos, it's 11. My daughter's 11, just turned. So she actually represents the most popular age for all Latinos, which of course makes us feel old. But the homework gap is a major equity issue in education and opportunity. And I appreciate all the programs out there that are so helpful, but adoption has to be built into your partnership. I see some amazing people on here from all these different companies, including one of our partners, Apple. And I just have to tell you, adoption has to be built into our programs. And of course, Broderick's with Comcast, who we work with in terms of NBC, Universal Telemundo, and Comcast. But we have to build in with Internet Essentials that the nonprofits that you're working with in the communities, that one of the measurables is that they help with adoption.
Absolutely.
That's got to be on the checklist.
Absolutely.
And but that isn't. And so I appreciate you saying that, Broderick, because I've been pushing for that with our sponsors as well, to say, put us on the hook. That should be part of what we're doing out there, if you really want adoption. Which is the key.
So Broderick, and I want to go to you and John on this question of this sort of, John sort of insinuated, and I use the same term, this digital infrastructure, this localized digital infrastructure with students. Let's go to Internet Essentials. In what way is it sort of feeding into this local digital infrastructure? And then John, I'm gonna pivot to you in terms of our libraries, right? And other nonprofit organizations that were sort of settling the turbulence that happened during the pandemic as well. Broderick, what about Internet Essentials?
Yeah, so, there are so many tools out there to help with what is on the one hand, a complicated problem, but in some respects isn't a complicated problem, in the sense that a lot of it really is about awareness and adoption issues. Very proud of the fact that it's been 10 years since we started Internet Essentials, and that's our signature digital equity initiative. We've been able to help connect 10 million people to power of the internet in their homes. Over this past year, again, a very, very challenging year, really something beyond anything we've experienced. We've been able to help our partners, and partners are very, very important. Of course, we're all in this together. We should be, to support the connectivity needs of their communities. We launched other initiatives, and as a result, very innovative connectivity solutions like lift zones, as well as the Internet Essentials Partnership Program that provides the opportunity for school districts and other organizations to fund and quickly connect large numbers of students and families to broadband access at home. Earlier this year, we also made a $1 billion commitment looking to the future to reach an additional 50 million Americans over the next 10 years through what we're calling Project Up. Overall, this $1 billion new investment targets education for low-income Americans to bridge the digital divide, including, again, additional support for our ongoing Lift Zones initiative, which is community-based centers to provide broadband, grants for nonprofit community organizations so we can create more opportunities for low-income Americans in media, arts, technology, and entrepreneurship, and continued investment in our landmark IE partnership program. This past September, devices matter, absolutely. Tools matter, absolutely. So we announced a donation of about 25,000 laptops with connectivity to low-income households in cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, which is my hometown, Atlanta, and Detroit, which is like my second hometown. You all see that big blue lamp behind me, go blue. So as well as expansion of our low-cost monthly plans to college students receiving Pell Grants. Look, the key to success thus far has been to attack the problem from multiple angles because it is a multi-dimensional problem. It's not just about deployment or affordability or access to devices or digital literacy. We're serious about closing the digital divide, and we are. The answer must be all of the above.
That's right. When I talk about that, I think I've spoken about it publicly on events, that this is not a binary construct that we're dealing with. It's not about giving people a device and access. It's actually, and Antonio, you sort of suggested that, this is actually symptomatic of poverty. Being digitally disconnected is an attribute of the type of poverty that we have actually seen in this country. And for those of you who are watching globally, as well as globally, when you don't have access in even developing countries, that says something about your ability to connect to the social, civic, economic, and health life, well-being of your lives. John, I want to talk about that because that speaks to the role of schools and libraries. I think people actually don't understand that many of those stoops that some of these students had to sit on were the stoops of libraries, who were able to extend their signals beyond their buildings just to accommodate that safeness, right? The safety of those students during this time. Some teachers even sat on those stoops, actually trying to get access. Talk to us about, in terms of what we're hearing, and I want to switch over to this infrastructure bill that will be signed very shortly, if it's not been already, in terms of the type of support that we need to give anchor institutions like schools and libraries, who are very much part of this all hands on deck strategy.
Well, that's a great lead in, Nicole. Thank you. And I was pleased to hear Broderick talk about this as a multidimensional problem. I was going to use that exact words to describe this. It is multidimensional, and the anchor institutions can be one of those dimensions to help solve this problem. There's no silver bullet. I mean, Comcast has done great things with the Internet Essentials program. I know there are other providers that have their low-income programs available too, and that's been going on for a decade. That's to be commended, but it hasn't solved the problem alone. So you need to activate the schools and libraries, and we can really provide another vantage point for solving this problem. So I will say this in a couple of different ways. One is that we're supportive of the Infrastructure Act that's going to be signed, I think, in an hour or so from now, and it's great. But one of the small problems with the act is that in the BEAD broadband deployment section, it said we're going to serve the unserved first, and then the underserved second, and then the anchor institutions third. And that doesn't make sense, because anchor institutions can help you serve the unserved and the underserved. The anchor institutions, we're not thinking of anchors, should not be thought of as a separate interest group that needs to be like satisfied. We should be thought of as part of the solution for connecting the unserved and the underserved. And the bill doesn't quite get that right. So we're going to work with the governors and NTIA to try to correct that. But I'll give you some more examples too. There are schools and libraries that have this enormous fiber capability that's being brought to the institution. But according to the E-rate rules, they're not allowed to extend service beyond the school or library campus. Now, the FCC did a good thing last year that we recommended the FCC allow them to turn their Wi-Fi routers and put them on the windowsill to broadcast the signal out to the parking lot. That's great, but it ended up with a lot of people sitting on the stoops of the library and the school. That's not ideal. What we really ought to be encouraging is for schools and libraries actively to be promoting broadband accessibility, usually through wireless technologies, to be able to reach the broader community around them. CBRS spectrum is now widely available. That's like super Wi-Fi, unlicensed spectrum. And there are broadband companies and equipment providers that have this equipment off the shelf now that schools and libraries can use to extend that service if the E-rate rules would allow them to do that. But the problem isn't solved for libraries. And I'm glad you mentioned that in particular, because a lot of schools have fiber, a lot of libraries don't. In fact, I was talking to someone from Nebraska earlier today that said 80% of libraries in Nebraska don't have 25/3 access. They have less access than the typical home. Well, that's not nearly enough for libraries to do their job of serving their communities and making those public access computers available. So we really need to focus on getting more fiber to those libraries that can then be a jumping off point to extend broadband service to the community. And that can be one of the solutions, not the only solution, but certainly a big contributor.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say anything about we are happy about the digital equity money, but we could have used a little bit more.
Yeah,
that bill.
That's right.
That actually ties to a lot of what we're speaking about. Keyla, I want to bring you in because I kind of want to stay on this trail here. I want to congratulate the FCC overall for taking on local partnerships as part of the emergency broadband benefit promotion and the emergency connectivity fund promotion. I also want to thank the FCC for rechartering under acting chairwoman, soon to be chairwoman Rosa Warso, the diversity committee, right? Who cares about equity? When you think about this FCC that you're in, having been a career professional there, and you think about what everybody's saying, is there going to be like this increased attention by the new commission to really focus on these local relationships even more?
Well, I have been at the FCC, like you said, for quite a bit.
I was going to say how long, Keyla, because I've known you for a long time too.
And I will start by saying every chairperson has their goals, their agenda. Under Chairwoman Rosenworcel, this is a fantastic agenda, and I'm not saying it because it really does. As Nicole said, we are renewing the Communications Equity and Diversity Council, which just launched under the new charter, which was previously, I'll say by the initial, so I won't get the name wrong, ACDDE. And that's really important because the previous group focused on diversity and equity, but this group has, for those of you who haven't attended the meeting, has 3 goals, 3 working groups that are very focused, and they do look into closing this digital divide. And I'm looking really forward to getting started and get the work done. But the FCC under Chairwoman Rosenworcel also has other things on the agenda that all relate. So I mentioned the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which she is very supportive of, and the Emergency Connectivity Fund. But as a whole, I think everything, and again, I'm speaking more as Keyla from what I've seen, rather than just this is what the FCC is doing. From everything that I see coming down the pike, diversity, equity, and inclusion will be part of, I think, everything that the FCC will be doing, whether it's their current programs or any future programs that we might be asked by Congress to develop. Just a reminder to everyone that we are under Congress, and Congress does give us a lot of the directives. And then that is why I say that. But there's also things that, and I will speak specifically to my bureau and my division. Consumer and Governmental Affairs and the Consumer Affairs and Outreach Division, we are always looking to work with partners on these issues. We are a small team in the division. We're about 11 people, and we rely a lot on partners who can directly speak to consumers that need our information the most. It is because we build a network of trust. It is because we want to get as much information out from the commission to consumers as possible. And that's why I go back to our most recent program, the Emergency Broadband Benefit. Without the partners, I don't know, we probably would have reached it at a slower pace, but right now we're, at almost 7 million households enrolled. And that's thanks to the work of our partners. We have the information, but again, our partners know exactly where the people that need the information most is about. So, to wrap up the conversation there on that point, we are looking to continue the partnerships. We are looking for, we never say no to anyone, and that's something that we always look at the Consumer Affairs. We always try to work with you and your community. We have newsletters, we have a lot of email blasts, and if someone wants to join our email blast, it's outreach@fcc.gov. And that's how we get information out there. We also try to, as I say, plain language, a lot of the issues that consumers are aware of. And when this emergency broadband benefit program first launched, we exactly did that. And we also have train the trainer sessions if anyone wants a more extensive view of what the FCC does.
Thank you, Keyla. And look, I'm looking at this Q&A. It is bare, and I'm expecting some folks to put some questions in this chat box because we are going to go to questions in about 3 to 4 minutes. Tony, I want to go to you because I think we've spent a lot of time, particularly as FOSI has a very diverse group of participants, talking about the ecosystem in general, where the fractures are, where the blind spots are, our aspirations and hopes for what the White House is going to do and what the FCC has been doing. But I want to talk about this other area that I think you do well at your organization, which is looking at this moment as an inflection point, right? A point where perhaps, even though my 14-year-old really did do a lot of things to my patience as her mother, as she was in online school, now that she has returned back to school, she is much better at multimedia presentations, independent thinking and learning. We're still working through mental health. I think all students during this period have mental health concerns. But talk to us a little bit about the whole child. What did the pandemic do to sort of remind us that while we are addressing these issues, we're still getting our young people prepared for these 21st century careers?
Yeah, Nicole, it's been a struggle. And I mean, the mental health part, we cannot lose sight of that. And as communities of color, a lot of times we're more reluctant to look at those issues, to actually show up. And telehealth is how people have been dealing with mental health. And so you have to have the internet in order to even access those resources. But also, I mean, for us, during this time, I mean, we've been teaching 100,000 kids how to code. That's a lot of kids that we're trying to reach. Without the right access to the internet, and especially in rural areas, we just had a whole strategy just on the southern border, nothing but border communities that we were really focused on during COVID. And it was even more difficult, but we just had to become more creative in terms of how to deal with it. And I think of working with, it all goes back to working with those local groups, right? We worked with Adán Gonzalez in Oak Cliff, Dallas, for instance, specifically because he has access to 500 kids every single day and their parents. That's an opportunity for us to, but we had to get him wired, and it was not easy where he was, and it was expensive, and it was laborious. So we're now trying to figure out how to get them hotspots and other ways of doing this work and be able to teach them and prepare them. But it's not just the jobs of the future. I mean, I just want to take a moment to say that, I don't know if you guys know this, but 79% of all new jobs over the next 10 years will be filled by a Latino, it's projected. We want to make sure that those jobs are able to support America because we have such a value proposition that we offer, and it's beyond the jobs that we're traditionally in. You know, we want to be able to make sure that we're filling all the jobs that America needs for us to fill. And programmatically, again, that's where we're working on that part of it. I want to also talk about how our kids, yours and mine, with access to a device and internet, are able to reach more people in a split second than Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Cesar Chavez could in their iconic lifetimes combined, which is the important work that Broderick and Keyla and John and you and everyone on this are doing right now. To be able, just on the social justice part, to be able to mobilize and organize, you can't do that without access to these tools. To untap their potential for social change, you can't do that without access to these tools. So it becomes bigger than simply preparing people for for jobs. And what we try to do through our Code as Second Language program is also allow them to problem solve, to make mistakes. I mean, sometimes, some cats get 9 lives. A lot of times black and brown ones get 1. So we want to make sure that they're able to work through mistakes and work through solutions, and have more confidence. And that access to technology is critical. I think my son actually adjusted better during COVID than any of us in our family, because he had a whole world that was through gaming. His social capital was based on gaming, and I know your son is a big gamer too. So I think there's a lot we have to be more creative about. I also want to push for us to be more impatient with our activism in the work that we're doing, and that's why I'm heartened by Broderick joining his position, and certainly Jessica has that impatience, and I know Keyla and others, that we want to make sure that we're more impatient with our work around connecting people to the internet, because we can't afford to wait. Every single moment that goes by as we're strategizing is someone else being left behind.
I was just going to let you keep going, preacher, because I believe what you're saying is right on point. I mean, listen, I put out this proposal called No Child Left Offline, which is sort of modeled after the No Child Left Behind Act, that I think we need to do something. People who might be listening, yes, we're really talking about the digital inequities that show up here because of all the systemic inequalities, but every child across this world needs to be connected, because there's so much that exists outside of their analog existences. But more so, young people know how to get this done, right? And I would say to Broderick, I'll point it over to you. I mean, part of this conversation on closing the homework gap, we're talking about students, but parents and grandparents play an important role in this. And I know in the Comcast Internet Essentials program, part of it is really coming to the whole family, and not necessarily the kid. What role? I see my friend Deborah Berlin is on here, who deals with older Americans who are often the grandparents of those young people. What role outside of partners do our multi-generational relationships also play?
It plays such a big deal. I can think, during the really the scariest months of the pandemic, when we were all wondering when we might be able to get vaccines, and especially worried about, our parents and our kids worried about their grandparents. My mother-in-law is 90 years old. She lives by herself in Edina, Minnesota. She's a very strong and proud 2-time cancer survivor. And yet, because she's in Minnesota and we know how the weather can get there, and because she lives alone, it was so important for her to be able to talk to maybe not so much me as her grandkids, and to be able to do that via video. And her broadband connection then became even more of a lifeline for her. And I just want to touch on one other thing, and this relates to what Tony was talking about too, in terms of mental health. As you mentioned, Nicole, it's been an honor of my life to chair the My Brother's Keeper first task force that we had in the White House, and then it's become an essential part of the Obama Foundation. And we used connectivity, particularly this spring, last spring and summer, to connect boys and young men of color from across the country together to talk to folks like President Obama, of course, but also the late, iconic, incredible figure, Representative John Lewis. He was able to join us as we talked with young men of color from across the country about the mental health challenges that they were experiencing. It was an extraordinary moment. Yet the fact that they were able to connect was so important. And as you mentioned, multi-generational. Tony was talking about impatience, and he's right. We are oftentimes, as people of color, asked to be patient about things. And we've been very patient about the digital divide, certainly at times. Now we have this unprecedented moment. The idea that, broadband is now seen as infrastructure by people from both sides of the aisle, that there's such strong support for addressing the digital divide at the FCC. I've had a number of great conversations with FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks about this as well. But look, this money that's being provided today as part of the bill that's being signed, we have to also be very diligent about making sure that it is spent the right way, that it reaches people who need the support. It will require all sorts of coalition building on top of the coalition we're building now. And we also have to be willing to insist on rigorous research that goes to what works and what doesn't work, so we can make sure we identify what works to get people connectivity and to get them to take the opportunities are there for them to empower their lives. And we have to just make sure that the money is being incredibly well spent, and that there's a lot of discipline to this, just like any other program that involves these kinds of investments. So it's also multi-dimensional and so unprecedented.
Yeah, no, I agree. And look, Brookings, we're paying attention to that too. So, the research is here when we're thinking about how this money is actually going to have an impact. This is a big down payment for those of you who are listening on broadband in America. And so we've got to actually look at this in a way that we're actually going to solve some of these issues once and for all.
Absolutely.
John, I'm curious because as I'm looking at some of the guests that are on this particular breakout session, and I thank all of you for spending your time with us, education is universal, right? What schools do is sort of a universal understanding of getting young people to the next level, the next trajectory. As my grandmother used to say, education is actually a trajectory towards getting out of poverty. She was 15 years old when she started to have 15 kids, right? And she was not an educated woman, but we landed up second, third generation actually picking up on this dream that is actually available to us, which is why I think what Tony's talking about in terms of demographics is particularly interesting. There are people listening, John, globally that are thinking about the role of schools, of educators in this debate, right? I call the teachers and the superintendents that were trying to build broadband networks as schools shut down as the heroes and cheeros, because that's not what they were trained to do, right? So I would love to hear from you as we sort of wrap in this conversation. And again, if you have any questions, please put that in the chat and I'll be sure to answer them. What do you think we need to do to sort of get our schools up to speed on just the nuts and bolts of broadband networks and infrastructure so that they can also have a conversation, whether they're here in the United States or they're globally, when they start to position education as one of the facets of closing this divide?
That's a great question, Nicole. As I hear the conversation, I think a lot of these solutions really have to be done at the local level. It has to be local community-based organizations. They have the most trust with the consumers who live in that neighborhood. And that's where the schools and libraries, but not just the schools and libraries, can fulfill that kind of role of a trusted institution. Just a couple of quick answers to your question. Keyla mentioned briefly the ECF program, which provided that $7 billion for the Emergency Connectivity Fund for schools and libraries. Well, that money was snapped up right away. When the FCC issued those two filing windows in September or August, and then September or October. And I think that's because it's a nice complement to the EBB program that connected those 7 million people who are connected to EBB. That's great. But it's an 80 million person problem. And you need to activate the schools and libraries as well to participate on that or with that. Unfortunately, the next version of the Build Back Better bill only has a paltry $300 million allocated to the ECF program. And that's not nearly sufficient for schools to do this job of thinking how they can continue that reach out to those families, especially the families on this free and reduced school lunch programs that really need that assistance. But the schools can funnel that money to them very, very quickly because they have that ongoing relationship with those students and those families. So that's one answer, is more funding for the ECF program to give schools the wherewithal to do this. The other is interesting. It extends beyond the schools. I saw a great video testimonial to local communities, and in this case, in Detroit, Michigan. And in this case, it was the churches and the community centers in Detroit that got together with a coalition to provide their own wireless connectivity. And it shows these young people on the roof of the building strapping the antennas to the rooftops of the buildings and beaming the signal down the street, line of sight to the next community center. And it was the pastors who were engaged in this effort to build their own local Wi-Fi network to connect people. And it was at the tail end of the video, it was sponsored by Verizon. So that's a great indication that this could be a win-win, for big companies to help sponsor these efforts at the community level and work with the schools to do so. More and more schools realize, because of the shutdown and the difficulty reaching those students that Tony talked about who disappeared, well, the schools want to serve them. That's part of their mission, is not just to serve them in the school grounds, but off campus at their homes and the parks and the libraries as well. So providing schools with the raw material and the resources to make that connectivity happen, that's going to be a key additional component to solving this digital divide.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think when we talk about anchor institutions, we should be looking at public housing as an anchor institution.
Yes.
We should look at shelter as an anchor institution. I think it's also important that we should be shifting these digital parking lots into digital parks, safe spaces where our kids can actually go out and engage open Wi-Fi so they can actually learn within the comfort of these communities in which they live. I mean, Keyla, that brings me, as we start to wrap up, to this question, I think, for the FCC, and in particular from your role as somebody who is constantly reaching out to community to figure out the blind spots. When you think about the big picture of all of this, right, and you think about, like I have in visiting communities across the country and the world, like, what are still some of the blind spots? Because I know we didn't speak about it, but if we're talking about the whole person, obviously telehealth is one of those blind spots that we have to focus on. But can you think of other blind spots that will help us sort of get to the whole child and the whole family that the FCC is working on?
So we're definitely looking at telehealth. There's a funding for a telehealth program because it's so important. In fact, this was a recent release. I believe it was earlier this month that there was more information about the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which sometimes people look at, so why are we bringing that? Because it is really important. This fund, a lot of the general consumers don't know about, people here on this call do. It's been the largest commitment of funding to date, but the COVID telehealth program is also something that's important because it's going to help doctors connect to their patients. And it's been mentioned before, mental health issues are really at the forefront. We have all been through COVID-19, and it's still, the pandemic is still ongoing, even though some people may not think of it as such. So some programs like that are definitely really important. And again, those are things that we look at. Having traveled throughout the country when we were able to travel and had permission to, we used to host our rural tours, which is something that really bought into, like, some of the other issues. So again, healthy children, and I look at children because we focus a lot on the K through 12 community. Not that we don't focus on others, but that is our future. So that's we look at that very, very strongly. Health is important, but also having access. And I know this goes a little bit off the topic per se, but it does relate back to it. Having healthy food available, that's really important too. Having access to good transportation, that is really important. I'll use myself as an example. I grew up in the city, have always been a city girl, but I know that in other parts of the country, people don't have as good access to transportation, which I was very lucky to have growing up, and I still have now. Those are some of the issues that may not be through a direct view, but it is important. And how do these issues all affected by broadband? Broadband access helps. It helps with smart grids. It helps with better access to health. It helps with just people being able to live in their communities and thrive in their communities also. Small businesses come into play also. If small businesses have connectivity, then they have better ways of offer their products, which positively affects the community. So all these things are kind of related, and one maybe seem as one-off, but those are definitely issues that we look at. And the last one I want to bring up is just digital safety. So we look at it from the commission. We have a lot of information for parents because as it's been mentioned here before, students and children are very savvy. I have a 15-year-old who knows more about internet than I ever did at her age and than I ever know now. So that's something that we have for parents. We have information for them about keeping track of what sites their children go on. We have information about passwords. We have a lot of different informations. But the bottom line is that as this conversation goes, it is essential to have a connection to internet. It's no longer I want to have, it is a must have.
Yeah. Tony said this as a moderator, and I can only but say so much, but I have so much more to say. So this is a message out to Steve. You better have me back.
You have a book that's coming out.
I know, and it's coming out. I gotta wait through all the process stuff before you actually see it.
Yeah.
But we have one question I do want to actually make sure we ask, because Tony's over there chatting and some people may be on the phone. We actually got a question which is around, and John, this may also apply to you. It is a question from Jodelle Seagrave, which is, are any of the organizations involved in access for foster kids through any of the anchors organizations that support that population? So Tony, why don't you and John sort of respond to that, and then we'll go towards wrap up.
Mine's real quick, and John is so much more thoughtful and smart that I can't wait to hear what he says. So, but for us, I've always said that our community leads us. It's not the other way around. So we try to be as malleable and as adaptable as possible in terms of what presents itself as an opportunity or a need. We have been working with any population that is underrepresented, and what we have to think about is the underrepresentation within our communities. Latinos of African descent, the disabled community, the communities that, to be honest with you, we need to focus on within our communities. And one of them are returning citizens. I'll just give you that as an example. So we have a program called Tech Presarios. You're 5 times more likely to not be hired if you are a returning citizen, and more likely to go back if you don't have a job. It's this cycle. So we have a boot camp for returning citizens to learn tech entrepreneurship, building websites and other things. We send them a computer. We talk them through. It's a pretty intensive boot camp. And now they can hire themselves and others through entrepreneurship in the tech space. We're doing the same thing, a modified version of it in terms of foster care. And there is somebody that actually, it's always, the inspiration comes from anywhere. We just have to be prepared to be inspired at any moment. So I met someone at Facebook when I was giving a speech there, and she approached me and said, "What about your programs for foster homes? I was a foster kid." And then I think of Virginia Case, who runs the League, the League of Women Voters. It's a huge organization that's been around for over 100 years, and she was a foster care kid. So we then started doing these programs, and we actually are working with a foster home in Panama through centers, because it allows us to be able to support more broadly, because we adapted everything to be more digital in terms of our programs. And as long as they're connected, we're able to do anything we can do. So just to let you know that that's my answer to that, is that we've done that work and we want to do more of it with the underserved communities within our underserved community.
Oh, John, we run out of time. So
I wanted to hear what he said.
John, you got, that's it. Well, we're out of time. I'm just going to say, you got 1 second and then I'm going to close out.
Well, I'll just make it 1 second. And Tony had some great things to say, better than I could say. Fortunately, the legislation about the infrastructure legislation that's being signed today mentions anchor institutions 29 times. And the definition of anchor institution is very broad to include any community support organization, including foster children and their homes. So look to the governors to implement and provide that funding to help all institutions, including those who house foster children, to get that connectivity they need.
That's right. So Broderick, Antonio, John, Keyla, thank you so much for actually being part of this conversation. To all of you, I think what you realize in this conversation, that you are in a good time in history. The pages have turned and actually something is going to happen. So with that being the case, we just ask all of you who participated, get schooled on what the new infrastructure bill actually allots And make sure you talk to your local legislators as well as your industry partners and civil society friends to figure out how to do this together. There are more seats at the table. Thank you so much. I am so glad that you all attended. And now I am standing between you and your coffee break. We will see you at the end of the conference. Thank you so much, Steve and Aaron, for having us.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.
So long.